Attention in the terminal. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your excursion into transportation excellence. And as always, I'm your conductor, Phil Bell, PB Chris, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast, come to you from the E. Hunter Harrison Chair at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And you know, we're back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone, and I had a wonderful time over the weekend. I visited a nice Shortline in New Jersey, which of course inspired today's topic to discuss Shortline railroads. But before we get into it, you know you're going to get a rant. You're going to get a rant because if not, I wouldn't be a highly trained rail enthusiast, and I most certainly wouldn't be Phil Bell. And so what am I ranting about? If you notice, our camera angle is a little bit different for those of you who are watching either on Rumble or YouTube. And the camera angle is a little bit different because a little while ago I went out and I bought a new camera. I said, yeah, we're getting a new camera. We're going to give you the best possible view of me that we can get. And so I went out, I spent tons and tons of money, all of $20 on a camera. And of course, the camera did not make it but 3 episodes. It totally blew out when we were recording this podcast episode. So there you go. You are stuck with the old camera angle of me, and we're going to call this, just like Rush had the Ditto Cam, we're going to call this Penn Central Cam because it's broken down and it's old and it's decrepit and it looks really dark. So yeah, there you go. You're seeing me on Penn Central Cam. But anyway, we want to talk about Shortline railroads. And I want to talk about Shortline railroads because, as I mentioned, I had a chance to visit SMS Rail. And the first thing I want to say is the people at SMS are terrific. Now, I visited their complex with permission. A good friend of mine was able to get me in. So don't go over to their offices and say, hey, I'm a rail fan. I want to get in. Phil Bell said I could get in. No. Not saying that. Not at all. But they've been very nice. Actually, a few years ago, held a public event for it was cars and trains. So they had both a car show and a train show. So you had locomotives from all types, including all of CSX's Pride and Service units were there, all 3 of them, in addition to a lot of SMS's Baldwins. Their B-23-7s, which are really neat, 2 of which are still in full Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe blue and yellow paint. So they're certainly awesome to see when you're out there on the main line. And although their main line in New Jersey is only 15 miles, of course, we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, SMS is a great company. They've done a lot with transloading, and in addition to their Logan Township location, which is where I visited, they have several. Now, the Westville branch, which is Westville, New Jersey, and serves the Eagle Point Tank Farm that they reach through Conrail, and also the Salem branch, which is 19 miles, so they operate for Salem County, which runs from Swedesboro to Salem, New Jersey, right by Mannington Mills, and the Port of Salem. And on the Salem branch, they're now operating the Woodstown Central Railway, which, as you may have found out early, if you follow us on Facebook, is slated to receive 2 Reading FP7s numbers 902 and 903. They purchased the 902. They're leasing the 903. So right now they have some former Jersey Central coaches, a Reading caboose, and they're soon to have a pair of Reading FP7s operating on the Woodstown Central. Now, why do we bring all this up? It's because SMS, by operating in these industrial parks, in these short areas, and by the way, they also operate in Pennsylvania and New York, they are showing how railroading can be very profitable and very successful on a small basis. Most of the carriers that we've talked about in operations up to this point have been your larger operations, whether it's Amtrak, the Atlantic Coast Line, Seaboard Coast Line, you name it. But now we're getting into shortline railroads and how that's always been a part of railroading pretty much since the beginning. And so taking us back to the beginning, you've got to remember that almost all of the railroads that we talk about in the 1950s, and the reason why I use the 1950s is that in the post-World War II era, railroads became very prominent as far as the news media is concerned. Now, they were already in a precipitous decline by that point from a financial and operational standpoint, but in that time, they were very much in the public eye simply because all of American business came into the public eye with the increase in media thanks to television, the continued expansion of radio, and you've got to remember that was the era of Charlie Wilson, who famously said the business of America is business. And we're talking about Injun Charlie in President Eisenhower's administration. Now, those railroads were all formed, or mostly formed, by short lines. In fact, there are very few. The Nickel Plate Road is one of the few examples where one railroad was built almost entirely to completion in one shot. So a good example of what we're talking about is the New York Central. Earlier names of the New York Central included the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. We know that the New York Central eventually took over the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, which is what ultimately got it into Chicago itself. It later on took over the Big Four, the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis, which is how it got a lot of its network in Ohio and Indiana, and of course got it to that namesake city of St. Louis as well. But the CCC in St. L., the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, the New York Central itself, they were all comprised of smaller lines, as few as 50 to 100 miles. And you had entrepreneurs like Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt who came along and said, okay, well, I see these railroads are operating in these small areas, so what I'll do is I'll buy them and merge them together. Or in other cases, this was initiated by the railroads themselves, which understood that, as we talk about over and over again, since they were following original paths of commerce, it might be good to get from point A to point B, but once you get to point B, a lot of that traffic is continuing to move on beyond their rails. So what would be the best thing to do? You would either buy a charter of a railroad that had not yet been built, because rail charters were just as ubiquitous as dot-coms were in the late 1990s, but like many of the dot-coms, they either didn't fill out their original goal, or in many cases were never actually built to start with. So you might purchase a charter that's not defunct, it's alive, because the legislature of that state or some other granting authority said, sure, you can go ahead and build a railroad from point A to point B, roughly following this path, and they would take it over and then actually build on that charter. So a good example of one of these small railroads is, and let me get that up for you. I know I'm not a big tech guy. I'm a little tech guy, highly trained rail enthusiast, not a highly trained broadcast specialist. But right here, you've got this railroad called the Genesee and Wyoming Valley, which is running from Caledonia to Retzoff, New York. Pretty short railroad, very much a short line. And if I recall correctly, it was something like 14 to 15 miles, not very long. This railroad operated to serve salt. So whenever someone says, yep, back to the salt mines, and it's Monday, so we're all headed back to the salt mines, although we call it Money Day here at the All Aboard podcast, it was built to serve the salt industry. And so 14 miles for over 100 years, that's what it did. Rolled along, salt, that's it. Well, eventually it was purchased by a guy whose last name was Fuller, and the Fuller family decided in the 1970s to incorporate it as reincorporate with a holding company. So I believe the initial corporation itself stayed, and they added a holding company on top of it. And that, of course, is what you now know today as the Genesee and Wyoming, the orange railroad that has taken over many short lines all across the country. But we'll get into that a little bit later in the podcast. So I point this out because this just shows how a lot of those small carriers, which in many cases made up the railroads of the 1950s that we tend to follow, Seaboard Airline, Atlantic Coastline, Lehigh Valley, and so on, how they came about, how they would serve a relatively small traffic base, and this is what led to their creation, but they had to grow. Now, aside from just following traffic patterns where they lead and that giving an opportunity for more profit, let's also remember that railroads work the best when they have a portfolio of traffic. That's because while the Genesee and Wyoming Valley, later the Genesee and Wyoming, may have been highly dependent on the salt mine, look at what happens when that traffic goes away. We just saw an example recently in Virginia where the Winchester and Western, which for years has served a sand pit near Winchester, operating between Winchester and Gore, and then they have other trackage that goes into Hagerstown, Maryland. But that primary shipper, that sand pit, which for a long time was Unimin and now is, I believe, Covia, a foreign company, decided, we're not going to use the sand pit anymore, at least not for the time being. So one of the primary sources of traffic on that railroad shut down. So a lot of railroads, even early on, recognized this, and they said, well, we don't want to be solely dependent on one customer or just a couple, so we want to grow and diversify. And the other thing that does is it smooths out the seasonality that comes with a lot of rail transportation. Going back to our discussion of the Atlantic coastline, a lot of their early traffic was agricultural related. So you had your harvesting seasons in the Southeast, so Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and take what was harvest into the Northeast through Richmond and Baltimore. Well, what happens? After the harvest season is over, well, then what are you going to do for traffic? Well, that was one of the big reasons why the Atlantic coastline then took over the Louisville and Nashville. So that created a portfolio of business for the entire company, whether it was the coal from the Louisville and Nashville, the agricultural products on the Atlantic coastline, the passengers on both. Altogether, you had an entity that was consistently profitable. That's one of the things that a lot of short lines have struggled with, because they, not really getting very far beyond their small beginnings, would stay with pretty small traffic bases. So that was one of the reasons to grow. But here's the thing. Not all short lines were able to do this. While you had a lot that decided to combine or were purchased and merged for a variety of reasons, and quite frankly, a lot of them cannot be traced to anything systemic, such as the broader economy or the way this was developing or that was developing. In a lot of cases, it was simply by luck. After all, who knew that Buffalo was going to become the major port on Lake Erie? That could have been the major port in the region, could have been the Oswego, which the New York, Ontario, and Western built to, which of course did not become the major port on the region, although the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western also went to Oswego. Piermont, New York was expected to be a major port on the Hudson River. Piermont, still a small town, never grew. That was the original terminus of the Erie. That's what led the Erie Railroad to extend itself into New Jersey through connections, which took it to Jersey City, which did become a major port on the Hudson River and also in New York Harbor. So in those days, it was relatively difficult to tell what would actually play out. You always knew that there would be some areas that were more successful than others, but it was always a crapshoot. In some cases, a lot of this was driven by the railroads themselves. That's how Chicago and Atlanta got to be so big, because they became such large railroad junctions thanks to a lot of railroads connecting there, which is what helped to ensure more of their future. Although, as I said, there are a lot of areas that didn't. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those, or give you some examples of what we're talking about. One railroad that I have always found interesting was originally named the Chattanooga Southern and became the Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. And yes, I'm stopping to have a sip of tea, chai tea, from my Penn Central mug. So don't worry, not only are you watching this on the Penn Central cam, but I am staying hydrated with my Penn Central mug. The tag route was operating, or did operate, in Alabama and Tennessee. And this carrier was, let me make sure, get back to my notes, or show prep is critically important. It was 92 miles. So 92 miles south from Chattanooga, or I should say southwest from Chattanooga, into Alabama. A lot of coal on the railroad, relatively short in terms of distance, did not expand beyond that. Ultimately, the tag route, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, despite the beautiful blue GP38, high hood GP38, which you can see, by the way, at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, it was taken over by the Southern and became part of Norfolk Southern. And even now, only a relatively small portion of its trackage, and I believe that is less than 20 miles, is now operated to this day. Another example is the Quanah, Acme, and Pacific. The QA&P was a carrier that operated in Texas, and to give you an idea, at its height, it was only 117 miles long. One of its major acquisitions was the Halton County Railroad, where they added all of 8 miles. That's right, 8 miles. So again, that gives you an idea of how short some of these can be. The QA&P briefly became part of a transcontinental railroad move that included the Frisco, but then Frisco and the Santa Fe, but then a lot of its transcontinental traffic got routed off of the onto other Santa Fe lines around the Frisco and the QA&P, and so it became just a small appendage of the Frisco and was later on merged into the St. Louis, San Francisco itself. And again, now only a small portion of that line is operated. Another example here, which is one of my favorites to talk about, is the Gainesville Midland, and this was the Gainesville Midland's only SD40 number 10. You see, it's has a unique look because of a Hancock air whistle, and if you say, well, wait a minute, that paint scheme looks a little familiar. Of course it does, because that's the Seaboard Airlines second generation paint scheme that it used on a lot of its diesels until it received the GP40s, which were the so-called Jolly Green Giants, because they were wearing a green that looked a lot like the Jolly Green Giant. Gainesville Midland extends from Gainesville, Georgia, to a connection with the Seaboard Airline. So it operated between the Southern at Gainesville and the Seaboard Airline on its route through Athens and into Atlanta. So relatively short pike. Was best known for continuing to use steam locomotives into the 1950s, when small diesels finally took over, culminating, of course, with the famous SD40, which unfortunately was cut up after, I believe, being rebuilt into a SD40-2 by CSX, and that line was only 41 miles long. And the other one that I wanted to talk about briefly, because again, showing what your small industrial railroads can do, the Hoboken Shore Railroad. So this one had a whopping 1.4 miles running from Weehawken to Hoboken. In Weehawken, it connected with the Erie. In Hoboken, it didn't connect with the DL&W, but you can see from that map that this was really something that you might even consider to be like a delivery truck almost of sorts, except a delivery truck on rails. Surprisingly, it had a fair amount of locomotives, actually more than about 4 to 5 at one point, including a beautiful 44-tonner that has been preserved by the United Railroads Historical Society in Boonton, New Jersey. So make sure when the date comes out to mark on your calendar to go to their annual open house, which usually takes place in September, and you can see the locomotive then. But the Hoboken Shore actually had a fair amount of what we would call now Fortune 500 clients, because in that day, this area, which now is primarily very expensive condos and houses, was heavily industrial. In fact, the Weehawken, Hoboken, Jersey City corridor was in an incredibly industrial area, so that's why you had so many railroads, whether you're talking about the Erie, the Jersey Central, the DL&W, the Hoboken Shore, of course, New York Central via its West Shore, the New York, Ontario and Western via the West Shore, the Reading coming in via the ownership or control of the Jersey Central. All of those railroads. Oh, and by the way, we can't forget the Pennsylvania Railroad. They all wanted to serve that area because it was so industrial. So the Hoboken Shore, at only 1.4 miles in length, played an important role in making sure that cargo was moved to the shippers who desperately needed to receive rail service. Nowadays, of course, the Hoboken Shore has been gone since the late 1970s. Nowadays, most of that would be transloaded at a point far away, in this case, even as far as Pennsylvania, the Bethlehem area, and then trucked to these customers. But in those times, a railroad like the Hoboken Shore was certainly a viable option. Now, I pointed those out to say that short line railroading is not new. It's something that's been around for a long time, and although we tend to think of everything in terms of the modern-day Genesee and Wyoming, it really wasn't. Now, most of the short lines that we talk about nowadays came about in the Conrail era and the Staggers Rail era. Now, remember, Conrail began operations on April 1st, 1976, and it did so by taking assets from several bankrupt railroads: Penn Central, Erie, Lackawanna, Lehigh Valley, Reading, Central Railroad of New Jersey, Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, and then there were other carriers such as the Ironton that was thrown in. There were portions that stayed out, such as the Providence and Worcester. They were ultimately removed. And remember, Conrail did not take all of these railroads. So whenever you read in a book that says that Conrail was a merger of these, that's not true. Whenever you read that, it absorbed, that's a lot of the terminology they like to use. That's not true, simply because the way that Conrail was structured, the United States Railway Association, which is the second USRA, they went through and went line by line that all of the Eastern bankrupt railroads had and set up what was called the Final System Plan. And to give you an idea of what that looked like, here is the preliminary system plan. This was the first iteration of what would ultimately become Conrail. They went through line by line and said, well, we think this line is viable and we don't think that line is viable. And the lines that were not deemed to be viable, even if they had customers on them, states were offered the ability to subsidize those operations. And in some cases, individual short lines were able to come in and purchase them. One of the examples is it was actually two railroads that operated together, the Virginia and Maryland and Delaware. They took over a large swath of what had been Pennsylvania Railroad trackage on the Delmarva Peninsula. So today, you know the Maryland and Delaware as the carrier that operates a lot of the short line routes on the Delmarva, as well as a partner in the Chesapeake and Delaware on former Erie-Lackawanna lines in New Jersey, and has now also expanded to another portion of the former Conrail trackage on the Jersey Central in central, we don't believe Central Jersey exists. I almost made a mistake there. Largely in South Jersey on the former Jersey Central Blue Comet, as well as getting into a little bit of North Jersey near the shore as well. So you know it as that, but originally it started as the Virginia and Maryland and Delaware operating some of these lines that Conrail decided that it did not want to take, or the USRA decided that Conrail would not take. This led to a short line boom. Now, the first portion of this boom came about in that 1970s era, largely because of Conrail deciding that it was not going to take a lot of these lines. Unfortunately, a lot of the carriers that ended up coming about because of that did not succeed. And one of the examples that I like to point out, and why I believe that the way Conrail was put together was so ruinous, is the Erie Western. Now, I know you're probably going to say, all right, Phil, are you talking about this because you love the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad and you tried to bring back the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad? A little bit. But also because the Erie Western is emblematic of the struggles that a lot of short lines face. See, the Erie Western extended from the Chicago area on the Indiana side to Wren, Ohio, and it was mostly supported by a state subsidy that was provided by Indiana because they wanted to help keep some of these railroads going that were going to be dismantled because Conrail either didn't take them over or because they explicitly said, look, we're not going to operate this for very long, and told shippers they're going to have to find another way to transport their goods. This is something that you could kind of compare to a Thanos snap in terms of the way that railroading operated. For more than 100 years, in most cases, you had carriers such as the Erie-Lackawanna and its predecessors, or Penn Central and its predecessors, operate a lot of these lines. And a lot of them, sadly, were either unprofitable or only survived because there were other lines that fed into them. The Erie Western, as you see here, operated the former Erie-Lackawanna main line across the state of Indiana, which was an amazing route for high-speed freight, when that's typified by its famous trains CX-99, NY-100, Advanced Croxton 99, and so on, that carried UPS traffic from Chicago to New York. And when you think about that, UPS decided to do business with a bankrupt railroad that was not only in financial trouble by the time they got there, but also was the smallest of the trunk line carriers and didn't have much in the way of support, because once it went bankrupt, it didn't have access to the Norfolk and Western's money anymore. But the Erie was able to provide the service consistently and with speed despite its drawbacks. So you could tell it was a great route, and even today would be something that Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, or otherwise would have loved to have. Unfortunately, without that traffic that's moving into the Chicago Gateway, and without that traffic that's moving east of Wren, Ohio, and Wren is just right on the border of Ohio and Indiana. I believe it's about 40 miles to the west of Lima. Without that, there was relatively little traffic. And so when you come in, when you have just the obligations of keeping a property going, which, oh, by the way, they didn't even own because the Erie-Lackawanna estate retained control of that line, the Erie Western couldn't survive because it wasn't generating traffic, and that meant the subsidy wasn't going to stay. The only good thing that came out of the Erie Western, because unfortunately, after the Erie Western quit and another carrier named the Chicago and Indiana tried to take it over, and which it did and operated it briefly, it went out of business and the majority of the track was pulled up ripped out. And since then, you've seen the bridges taken down where it crossed over highways. You've seen adjoining farmers that actually had underlying title to the property because of, in some cases, a lot of the agreements that allow the railroad to operate will include a right of reversion. So, somebody went to Farmer John in the late 1800s or early 1900s and said, "Hey, Farmer John, we'd like to build a railroad across your field. We'll pay you X." And he said, "Sure, yeah, no problem." I mean, after all, he's getting some money. And part of the agreement, which nobody really paid attention to or cared about at the time, is if you ever take the railroad out, well, the property goes back to me because my field is on the other side of your track as well as this side. So we want to be able to get back to it. And, what other use would there be for a maybe 100 feet of linear land, without being a railroad? So who else would want it but the farmer? So in a lot of cases, after these tracks were taken out, which no one ever expected would happen, it reverted. So as a lot of the discussion I was reading, it made me very sad when I was doing the show prep here. Yeah, bringing that track back would be very difficult. So it's gone and likely gone forever. But there was only one good thing that did come of that end. It actually was a good thing. And that was a man named Tom Hoback. And Tom Hoback, you might know as being the founder of the modern day Indiana Railroad. And the Indiana Railroad is another example of what happens when in the post-stagger Shortline era. And you've probably seen these guys because they have their, at least until recently, the SD 9043s that you see here in this photo. And they actually took over routes from Canadian Pacific as well as the Illinois Central and built a very, very dense and profitable network in their section of Indiana and Illinois. So you can get an idea of why, while the Erie Western was a failure, that Tom Hoback and the Indiana Railroad were successful. And so that tells you, not just in railroading, but in business, where, you will have, sadly, some things that don't work, but that doesn't necessarily mean the book is closed once things tend to dry up. But that brings us to the other aspect of shortline railroading, which I want to highlight, and we touched on a little bit earlier, and that was your portfolio shortline owner. Now, most of the portfolio shortline owners that you tend to think of are your Genesee and Wyoming that operates railroads all across the country and even internationally, such as Australia, or even smaller portfolio owners like the Iowa Pacific. But one example I wanted to highlight here is one of the early portfolio shortline operators, and that's Pensley. Pensley had operations in several different states, the Northeast as well as Florida. They sold their last carrier in 2022, which pretty much brought the end to almost 100 years of shortline railroad operations. But Pensley was a great example of the model that the Genesee and Wyoming and Rail America would take later, which was taking a lot of these cast-off scraps from Conrail, Norfolk Southern, CSX, and so on, and taking those scraps, which could be as little as 5 to 10 miles, and building consistently profitable carriers on top of them. And that was shown in the years after when, for example, you saw Rail America be purchased by a private equity firm, which was Fortress, the same people who are behind Brightline and for a while owned the Florida East Coast. And then they sold that to the Genesee and Wyoming, which we remember from being one of the initial shortline railroads, and it went all across the country purchasing lines. Now, what was different, though, about what the Genesee and Wyoming and Rail America did is a lot of the carriers that they purchased, and when I say purchased, I mean purchased routes and then built carriers around them, a lot of those operations are actually leased from the Class 1 Railroad. CSX had a substantial program that did this in the mid-2000s, which saw railroads like the Buckingham Branch grow, and saw carriers like Genesee and Wyoming grow as well. And in these instances, the railroads will lease the property for a period to the short line. And what's different about this and the 1980s era wave, when those carriers had to purchase the track, is that, number one, it has a lower cost of entry because even a short 5-10 mile railroad route might run you in the $20 millions. Why is that? Because a lot of times the railroads look over and say, you know what? If you can build on that real estate, it should be based, the value of that real estate should be based on the adjoining property. And a lot of the adjoining property, if there's no right of reversion, can include, excuse me, I should say, assuming there's no right of reversion to an adjoining property owner. A lot of the adjoining property can be office buildings. It can be industrial. It could even be the highway department that wants to use that route to connect one highway with another. So therefore, your competitors for even a small, what some might consider to be rickety and low profit and low everything rail route will be fairly substantial, and therefore the cost can be high. So one of the ways that Rail America and Genesee and Wyoming, among others, were able to make their business model grow in the 1990s and 2000s was by reaching these lease agreements. Now, the thing about the lease agreements, though, isn't just that, like, I might go rent a house, and so I can have all my friends over, I can do whatever I want, as long as I don't burn the place down and I pay the rent. These lease agreements include what are called paper barriers. Now, this is something the Surface Transportation Board really doesn't like, and a lot of shippers don't like, because the paper barriers often say that regardless of where the short line goes and who it connects with, that all of the traffic has to go through the carrier who sold the track to you, or excuse me, who leased the track to you in the first place. And so most shippers would like the option of being able to pick from several different railroads, because that lets them ask those large railroads to compete on price. But the paper barriers make it so that while, on one end of the line, we do have a physical connection with Norfolk Southern, at the other end of the line, we have a physical connection with Canadian Pacific. Since Canadian Pacific leased us the line, that traffic has to go through Canadian Pacific or have a whopping surcharge placed on it. And usually the surcharge is so high that the shippers won't want to pay it, and therefore you send the traffic through the original carrier in the first place. Now, these are good and bad. They're good in that they allow the short line to come in, and short lines are typically better at prospecting for business than the larger carriers, for the simple reason that a large carrier is at a disadvantage when it comes to trying to work with a large number of small to medium-sized enterprises. That's not because railroads are special or bad or good or anything like that. It's because any large company is going to have a difficult time working with a large amount of smaller customers. And the best way you can look at that is the next time you go to some place like Walmart or otherwise, look at all they have to do in order to set their operation up so that they can deal with that crush of customers that comes in every day. They have to have very specific procedures. Their employees have to be trained in a specific way, and they have to execute those procedures in a very, very regimented fashion in order for it to work. Well, a railroad has a very difficult time because, as you know, large railroads, Class 1 railroads, don't have as big a customer service apparatus because they're typically dealing with larger businesses, and therefore they're more oriented toward that. So that's why it benefits them to have short lines take over some of these shorter routes and negotiate with the small customers, because then the short line itself becomes the customer. And so rather than dealing with 15 to 20 companies where someone's going to have to make sure and call each one and make sure everything is working, this way the railroad only calls another railroad who they're already working with and says, hey, are you getting everything you need? And they say, yep. Here's the car supply we need. This is how it works. So that's the kind of relationship that develops between the short line railroad and the larger railroad, and why the paper barriers make sense. Because then the new short line does not have to spend as much capital, let's say 20 million, 25 million, to buy a small piece of track and then figure out how to go out and prospect for business while you have loans coming due and otherwise. In this case, you lease it. You have a little capital outlay, you go ahead and you operate, you bring in more business, and you grow your business, basically with the large railroad helping to fund your operation, even if they're not directly sending you cash. So that was one of the big changes. But the issue with paper barriers has remained for a long time, because a lot of shippers, regardless of the fact that rates have come down significantly since the Staggers Rail Act came about in 1980, and pretty much every chart that you see will show you today's rail rates are dramatically lower than they were in the era of rail regulation, when the federal government, and yes, for you liberals out there, the federal government set the rates, and it jacked them up very high year after year after year, which is one of the big reasons why railroads declined and Conrail was necessary in the first place. But many customers, despite that, still want the ability to negotiate at least with another railroad. So they typically don't like the paper barriers and would like to see the Surface Transportation Board universally abrogate them or take some other action that would ultimately be ruinous to the short line industry itself. So that's really the way that short line railroading operates today. You have that combination. Some of those original short lines still hanging on, like the Winchester and Western, however small the traffic bases may be. Others that were founded in the pre-Staggers era that continue to operate, such as the Louisiana and Northwestern. Still others, such as Patriot Rail and SMS, that have built their business largely by serving industrial parks, very, very small operations, which could be 20 miles or less. And then your large portfolio short line owners, such as Genesee and Wyoming and Watco, that are continuing to work with Class 1 railroads to either purchase or lease, but mostly lease more track, and also looking for opportunities such as the former U.S. Steel railroads, where there may be opportunities to operate something that's a little bit between a small industrial railroad and a traditional short line of 50 miles or more. So that is what the short line picture looks like. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've been able to stick with us despite our interesting camera angles here. And we will be back on Wednesday with a new episode where we're going to talk about a very tragic event, which was the 1987 Chase, Maryland wreck, which just had its anniversary last week, so it's definitely worth a time to revisit. As always, please visit us on Patreon and visit us on our website, which is the best railroad website out there, allthingstrains.com. That's allthingstrains.com. And finally, in the comments or by email at info@allaboard.media, let me know what topics you'd like us to cover and what you think of this and how we can make it better. Because remember, this isn't just a one-way train. This is something that we serve you, and therefore we want to make sure that you are getting the experience with All Things Trains and the All Aboard podcast that you want out of the best railroad podcast there is. So we'll see you later this week, and I hope you have a great day.